Hi, let me tell you something about Western non-backed straight cutting saws. Given the range of my work, I can get away with just using two of these types of saws. I've got a Crosscut 10 point per inch 22 inch, and that's known as a panel saw, and a 24 inch 6 tooth per inch rip saw. And that actually gets classified somewhere between a half rip and a panel rip saw. So let me run down on the names of saws that would be in this group. The panel saws are the smallest saws. They have more teeth per inch and they're used mainly at the bench. Having more teeth, they leave a better surface finish on the cut, but they also cut slowly. You move up from the panel saws to the hand saws in the crosscut range. Hand saw for cross cutting is around about 22 or more inches and will generally have about 6 to 8 teeth per inch. That obviously leaves the finish a little bit rough. In the rip saws, we start with the panel saws, panel rip saws, which are up to about 22 inches in length, and they have 8 teeth per inch, and that leaves a reasonable finish with the rip cut. Next up from that is the half rip, which is up to about 28 inches in length, about 24 to 28 inches in length, and we generally have about 4 teeth per inch, dropping down to about 3 teeth per inch down at what is the heel end, so the end by the handle, and going above that we get the actual hand rip saw, which goes above 28 inches in length, and we generally have 3 teeth per inch. Now my rip saw lies somewhere between panel and half rip. It has 6 teeth per inch. It leaves me a reasonable finish and it's a reasonable rate of cut. And for the amount of work I do and the scale of work I do, that's absolutely ideal. This third saw that I've recently acquired is just 20 inches in length. It's cross-cut tooth profile with 8 teeth per inch. So it's going to give me a reasonably rough finish. Now what I'm going to do with it later on, maybe in this series or perhaps over on the other channel, is I'm going to convert it to a panel rip saw. We'll keep the 8 teeth per inch, but we'll change them to a rip profile, and that'll be really excellent for doing tenon cheeks at the bench. So let me just show you some of the basics of using these saws for rip cutting and cross cutting. So I'm going to be cross cutting on my sawyer's bench using the clamping method that I've got on there, which is some dogs and a wander pup. Now I've penciled in my cut line. If I was going for higher accuracy, I'll be using a back saw, and that would be knifed in. You can knife it in if you want to. Now just using the tip of the saw and holding it on the line using my thumb as a kind of fence, I'll just draw back a couple of times just to start the curve, and then supporting most of the weight in my sawing hand of the saw. A few forward shortcuts gives me a good curve there, and I'm ready to start sawing properly. As I'm sawing, I'm able to sight down that line I've got on the back of the board with my saw plate to make sure I'm keeping nice and plumb. Take a look at my stance. You'll see I've got my back leg in line with the left hand side of the saw, my shoulder again in line with the saw plate, as is my elbow, and my wrist stays nice and locked. And I'm over the work, bent over the work here, and get a lot of power into my strokes. I'm pulling the saw almost up to the tip and going down almost to the heel. And you'll see also the angle of the saw with regards to the work is around about 45 degrees. An alternative method of holding the work is to use your sawing leg to prevent the work coming back towards you and rotating, and kneeling on it on the bench with the non-sawing leg. Disadvantage is that the work isn't supported underneath right up close to the bench, and so it can flex when it's narrow. And this is showing very much the flexing of the board because it's thin and it's standing a long way out from the bench. So one advantage is if you can clamp it on the bench, you can get nice and close to the support. Now as we approach the end, we want to be supporting that waste piece, so you'll see my hand come round and support that. Depending how long it is, we might have supports out further, and this hand would just be to steady it to stop it from tipping. So I'll slow my strokes down, shorten them, and we can cut that piece off, and we've got no breakout, no splitting underneath. Rip cuts can be made off the side of the bench. For short lengths like this, it's easy to clamp them on and move yourself as you saw, but for longer lengths you'd simply hold the work with your knee and move the work as you progressed. A few short light strokes get a kerf established. I've hardly started and the saw's already binding in this piece of holly, so I'll apply some candle wax to the plate. If the kerf starts closing up and binding on your saw, just put a little wedge in the end to open it up. Move either the work or yourself as you progress to keep the cutting position optimal. And if you're using a wedge, don't forget to keep moving that up to keep the kerf open. If I was ripping something that's this narrow, it'd be quite difficult to clamp it on the edge of the bench and saw it. So we're going to slot in the middle of the bench, give support on both sides, draw back a couple of times. A rip saw makes an awful noise when you do that. And supporting some of the weight of the saw, start the cut. Now when I'm cutting a thin piece like this through the central slot, the only place I can kneel on it to hold it is in line with the cut. If I kneel naturally like this, then the saw is in line with my chest rather than my elbow, shoulder and wrist. So my cut, or my wrist, is having to flex during the cut, and it makes it difficult to stay on track. So the best thing I can do is throw this leg out, the non-sawing leg out, lean my body across at the hips, bring my wrist, elbow and shoulder all in line with the cut, and I can keep my wrist locked all the way throughout the cut. Makes it a lot easier. And obviously as I progress the cut, I'll move the work forwards to avoid cutting through my bench. Now the standard grip for both of these saws is 3 fingers through the handle hole, index finger on the outside, not giving any pressure and influencing the saw at all, with the wrist locked and the thumb around the back here, all the work is done with the base of the thumb against the handle. That would be the standard way of doing it. If you need a bit more power, maybe you're binding, you've tried wax, you've tried wedges, it's still a little bit tough, you can bring a hand over the top here, the thumb around the end of the horn, and you can use both arms. When you're locked in with both arms, I do feel that loses your accuracy, and it's a bit more difficult to control the saw, in my opinion. For the reverse handhold, we put 3 fingers through the grip, on the index finger pointing along the grip, and the other hand on the back side, like so. That can be quite comfortable as well if you need a break from the normal method. But again, keep the wrist locked, elbow and shoulder in line with the plate. Now if you're using normal sawhorses like these, for me I find it uncomfortable to get my knee up there to try and hold the work, or this knee, you know, it just doesn't work for me. If I have to use them, then I'll do it from a seated position. So I'll sit on my work and I'll work like so, and I will need both hands because it's an awkward position. So I use a two-handed grip and I'll be working like so. Now if you're ripping with standard horses, it's the same sort of thing. You'd start with the work hanging out in front of you, and for me certainly I'd need the double grip again to be working there. I'd find it quite uncontrolled as well because I'm working in front of my chest. Once I'd cut a certain distance, then I'd bring the cut area back behind the support. I can continue the work after there, again sitting on it. If you're trying to rip something flexible like this piece of MDF, you know, it's just not going to work on regular sawhorses. You need to support it with some planks. I've got some hardwood boards here, nice and firm. I can rest my work on there and cut between them. That gives it much more support, nice and rigid, and a lot easier to cut through. Be it crosscut or rip cut, same thing. If you've got a wide board and it's flexible, then put some bearers underneath it. To cut tenons in the bench, I've marked up my work and I've clamped it up in the end vise, although a face vise would be perfectly okay. So taking the rip saw now, we present it at the same sort of angle, around about 60 degrees to the work. But it's different for us because we're standing at the bench, the work's held at an angle, so it's almost horizontal. Draw back a couple of times to start the curve. And then I'm going to track the line on my work down this end and down the face here, supporting some of the weight of the saw just till we get started. Hopefully you can see here I've got my body again to the left hand side of the saw plate, wrist is locked, elbow and shoulder are in line with the saw plate. I've got a reasonably wide stance with my sawing leg backwards to give me plenty of support. So saw down to my mark here. Now I can rotate the work in the vise, saw down, using the saw cut I've already made as a guide for the saw. And here I've got a slightly different hold position here on the handle, because to begin with I'm lowering the saw, but again I've got a locked wrist, I'm just using my elbow and my shoulder. That just starts the cut, then I can convert to standard grip, lower my body a bit. And that's the cheat cut done. using the same stance but with the crosscut panel saw, we can cut the shoulder line using a bench hook.
Please take a moment to like, comment and subscribe, and follow me on social media for extra photos and videos from the workshop. Cheerio!